grand totals, subtotals, how they work, how you can get them to do what you want. As far as my background, this is a nice picture of where I work. I'm on the other side of this building past the morgue and the dumpster and all that kind of thing. Tucked away in the back corner, and I work in the quality and management department here at Southern Maine Med, doing working with lots and lots of different data. So, so to start out, one of the things for me is not just to teach you in that old story about whether to teach somebody to fish, feed them for a lifetime, give them a fish, feed them for a day. I'm more on the teaching you how to fish, so you'll understand what Tableau is doing, so you'll be able to take stuff and go in your own directions with it. So in those areas, spending some time on how Tableau is computing the grand totals and subtotals, and then some walkthroughs on how to customize your own grand total and how version 8 changes things a bit. And then I'll take stops along the way for questions, but certainly if you have any, I'm not able, let's see if I can pull up a chat window over here so that way I can see things too, but certainly interrupt if you have any questions. So the key thing to know about Tableau is that each grand total and subtotal, so whatever measure you're putting on the view, it's a separate computation of that measure, and it's at a different level of aggregation. So we'll do a demo of that right now. So I've got two views of Superstore sales data here, same workbook. So if I drag out a category here on the columns, and let's work with average sales on rows here, and then we have our grand totals turned on. So what we're seeing here is 3,004, 814, 2898. And then the grand total is 1776, which is not the average of these values, it's the average across the entire database, which is the same thing we can see if over here I just drag my average sales out. That's going across the whole data set. So these two separate computations. So there's another way of, so in terms of thinking about this, it's actually a separate pipeline for how Tableau does things. And I'll make this nice and big so it shows up better. So this is something Joe Mako and I have been working on how Tableau is working under the hood. So starting out, you have the computation of your regular measures, densification, blending, all this computation happens before. Then coming through, Tableau actually splits your calculations into doing three different sets of things. So one path is computing your regular table calculations and going through there. Another path is computing your total-based reference lines on regular aggregates, and then there's this other path, which is the one we're focused on today for grand totals and subtotals. And there, it's further divided into computing the grand total and subtotal for regular aggregates, and then table calculations. It's actually redoing the table calculation at a different level of detail. So your compute using is kind of different than what you might see. And we'll talk about that more later. And then Tableau puts that all back together to render the view. So any questions on that at this point? So if I'm not seeing anything or hearing anything, I'll assume that's a sent, and we'll keep going. So one demonstration. Does the word path have special meaning? In terms of path, when I use the word path here, it means just that it's a different computational path through the system. So I can give you one example that we can visually see here is that table calculation filters are applied along this path of computation. So it's going, table calculation filters will filter out the results of your table calculations. They won't actually filter out the reference lines, and they won't filter the results of your grand totals or subtotals, because they're only applied within this path. And Jay asked about slides. We'll be posting the slides and this workbook that I'm using up onto the TDT website after the call. So let's go back to Tableau here. Is there a situation where Tableau calculates the averages of averages? It does that whenever we do something like if we do a window average of sales. And let's pull this up so I can show this to you right now. So I actually have a calculation here, which is my window average of average sales. So this is just a plain old table calculation computation, and if I drag it out into the view here, so here we have the window average of average sales being computed across the whole data set. So it's taking the average of furniture, the average of office supplies and technology, and averaging all of those to get the 2239. But here when we come to the grand total row, it's actually taking category out of the view and doing this computation across the whole thing. So if I do this window average of average sales over in this view that doesn't have everything on rows, we get the same result. And so there's a workaround for this that I'll go into later in the here. Just checking my notes here. So one of the things to understand here is this is more like the total function than it is the window and running functions. And I think it helps us to understand what's happening there when we really understand what total is doing versus the others, because the total and the grand total and subtotals are all doing that computation at a different level of aggregation. The window and the running functions are doing an aggregate of an aggregate. So here's a case where I have this window average, window sales. So this is getting this window average of our sales across the whole data set. Now if I do my analysis totals, show my common grand totals, I've got that 1776. So Tableau is kind of decreasing this level of detail from here, as I talked about. Sorry, this question from you and Jay kind of jumped me ahead in my notes here. Let me just make sure I'm where I want to be. Okay. So there's, so if I do my total average sales here, we can see this is computing this across the whole data set. The window average is here, and our average sales. So there's a way that, and if I do total average sales over here, same thing. So we can look at these totals and, sorry, I'm getting distracted here. So these are performing them at this different level of aggregation. And so when we're doing this, totals LOD. So when we're looking at sorry, I'm getting all confused here. All right. So for aggregations, what we can look at is within our detail rows, there are the regular aggregates are done as an aggregate. The total calcs are the aggregate at a different level of aggregation, and the window we're running are the aggregate of aggregate. When we get into the grand total or subtotal, we're decreasing the level of detail in each. And that's what's happening with this window average, is that we've decreased the level of detail for it. And so for this one, it's why it's coming out with 1776 and not the other one. So when we're talking about customizing grand totals, Tableau doesn't give us any way into this to kind of look into it to say, okay, I want to just change this. So we need to do calculations ourselves. And there's a few different ways of doing that. So the traditional way that Tableau has asked us to do that is by separating things out into using two worksheets and a dashboard. So you generate your total rows like this. I have average of sales, category, year of order date. You create another worksheet that has your data lined up in the right way, that has a computation which generates the right aggregation that you want. And then you put them together on a dashboard, which has a number of advantages and disadvantages. One advantage is you don't really have to mess around with a whole lot of custom calcs. It'll work with any data source. It gets fiddly. If there's any filters on one worksheet, you got to make them sure they're applying to both. If you're doing selections or anything on the first worksheet, it won't change anything. If I decide to filter out something, like I exclude furniture, it's not changing the grand total below. And if I do something like category is within a hierarchy, if I expand that hierarchy, the hierarchy expands, but not the grand total row. So it just doesn't work that well. So there's another way we can do things within a worksheet is to look at the min and the max of the rows. So here I have a simple calculation called min category, which is just looking at the minimum of category. So we can see this within our grand total, the minimum category. So for furniture, it's furniture. For office supplies there, within the grand total row, it's furniture. I have another calculation, max category. If I bring that out, we can see it's technology. So when we talk about the grand total row being in a different level of detail, it's effectively removing all of whatever pills are on rows for the grand total when we have a column grand total. And if it's a subtotal, it's going to remove that. So for example, here's, so the kind of rule of thumb here is that within the grand total, all of our discrete dimension pills are gone from the rows shelf, and that's the computation that's going to be done. When we're in a subtotal, it's removing all of the discrete dimension pills to the right of our subtotal pill from the rows or column shelves. So if we go back to here with our subtotal, we have our subtotal is happening here. So we have an average of sales computed within the furniture category, average of sales within office supplies, our grand total. So we still have category in the view for our region subtotal. Whereas when we go to the grand total row, everything is gone, and we're just computing it across the whole data set. So these are key things to keep in mind whenever we're wanting to customize these, because in here with our min category, max category, we can now know that we have multiple categories in our grand total row. So what we can do now is create a custom field. So here's my min max category for the grand total row. And I have a calculation. If the min category is the same as the max category, We know that's going to be true within our category. We'll do our average sales, or else we're in the grand total row, and we'll sum the sales. So that works here. Now, when we want subtotals, we've got to get a little more complicated here. So if I just have this min-max category for it, we can see it's not actually summing up here within the category, because within that calculation, if the min category is equal to the max category, well, that's true here within the subcategory of furniture. When we're in the subtotal row, we just have the same category, so it's failing there. So we need to change the calculation to be aware of the level at which we're working. So in this case, we're just min subcategory equals max subcategory, average sales, sum sales, bring that into the view, and now we have the summation happening for each. However, this fails in a couple of cases. If we expand or collapse our hierarchy, so here I've just gone down to category, and now we have multiple categories for each. So for example, if I start a new worksheet and I put my category out here, and if I do something like, let me just do a count distinct of my subcategory, we can just see there's multiple subcategories. So we know that minimum subcategory equals max subcategory here is going to fail and will return our grand total row, or the equivalent of the sum of sales for each row. So I'll just put sum of sales in there, make it a little wider. So that's what we're seeing here, is it's failed. Another issue here is if there's only one item in the subcategory, like if I exclude these three, so I just have the one subcategory, the min-max calc, the evaluation for the total that we're looking to see in our row fails, and I'm returning the average. So it's useful in some cases, but not useful in all cases. Also has the issue that we have that in a lot of cases, we want to do an aggregate of an aggregate, like if we want to do the average of averages or the sum of the averages or something like that. So there we can move on to another technique for doing that. So right now I'm just starting out here with my category. We have our average sales, and then we want our sum of our grand total should to show the sum of the average sales. So here's where we're going to use the trick that Joe Mako showed me. And the thing that we need to do here is increase the level of detail within our grand total row. Now, like I was talking about earlier, when we're in the grand total row, it's as if the category doesn't exist. So let me put my average, change that measure back to average sales. Doesn't exist in here. So we need to increase the level of detail here, but we don't have anything on rows. But we do have this handy level of detail shelf. So I can drag a copy of the category dimension, and that's all that this is, out on here into the level of detail. And we can see here it's returning the same results for each category, but in the grand total we're getting overlapping marks here because we've increased the level of detail. And there's a 3004 and 814 and 2898 in here. And then we can have a simple table calculation, like window sum of average sales. out here, and I'm going to put this in the view, and I'm going to set this computation to compute using category copy. Now what this is doing is addressing on category copy and partitioning on category, at least in the detail rows. So what's happening with that is when we're in the detail rows, its addressing and partitioning are the same, so it's giving us the same result as a table down in the detail rows. They're just one row per thing. But when we get to the grand total row, we effectively have category copy in the level of detail, while we've taken out category. So if I showed right here, and I'm going to drag out my window sum of average sales, and I'm going to set my compute using the category copy. So this over here on the right is what's happening with the grand totals on the left. And Joe just had a comment about calling it working with VizQL, and this goes back to this piece of understanding what Tableau is doing under the hood, and building this in the cases where Tableau is not making visual the things that we want it to do. We have to visualize it ourselves, which is part of this. So that's doing this level of aggregation. Now, one thing we have here going on is we have this overprinting happening because we're actually returning additional marks here. If I take average of sales here, we can see that Tableau is drawing 6 marks, these 3, and then it's drawing 3 more in the grand total row. So that's where we use the easy hack to reduce the number of marks, putting if first equals 0 around your table calculation, so it reduces it to only returning 1 row. And then I'll set my compute using of the optimized calc to category copy, and we get rid of that overprinting, and we get the view that we want. Now, now with this, and when we go to version 8, things start looking a little differently. So here's Tableau version 8, same workbook. If I open this, so here's my optimized calc. I open it up, looks exactly the same as V7. I'll just drag out my window sum of average sales here. So these two look just the same. But let me try doing this in version 8 from scratch, and you're going to see things looking a little different. So let's bring out category on here, and let's say I know I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring my category copy onto the level of detail. So instead of showing the ABC, Tableau is now showing squares now in version 8. And that's because in Tableau version 8, when we don't have any continuous pills, so that would be green pills on columns or rows, it's using the new non-Cartesian layout, also called OO stacking. And if I turn on totals here, turn on my grand totals, we can see we've got our 6 marks here. If I take category off, it's going back, but I've increased the level of detail. So we're seeing 6 marks here. And if I bring in my window sum of average sales, so here in this view, I'm seeing Tableau drawing out these 3 different totals. I change my compute using a category copy. So it's getting the correct results, but still spreading this out. And it actually gets a little worse than that because it's filling up as part of the OO stacking, it's going to try to fill up the whole view. Even though I'm in normal view, it's filling up the whole view. So let's say I want to get rid of, I only want to show the first value in this, so I'm putting my optimized calc in here, set my compute using the category copy. It's still in this OO stacking kind of view. It's showing all of this, and part of how we know this is that we can see it's drawing 6 marks down at the bottom. Now, one of the ways we can think of to get rid of Tableau showing extra marks or stuff we don't want in the view is to drag kind of a standard way is I take whatever my table calculation is, it's only drawing the marks that I want. I'm going to control drag that onto filters, set it to special non-null values. Does nothing in this case. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that the table calculation computation and table calculation filters are on their own path through VizQL. And here, the table calculation computation is a separate calculation. So the filter setting has nothing to do with what's happening here. So that's not going to work. So there's 2 options we have at this point to deal with this. One of them is we can go to Analysis, Stack Marks, which is on right now by default in Tableau version 8. Just turn it off. We're back to version 7. Another option we can do is we can take category copy, drag a copy of that onto the pages shelf. Or it actually doesn't even need to be here because once it's on the pages shelf, it's part of the view. And in this case, we're just showing the first page that goes along with this first value of category copy, and that gets us our view. If I go to the other ones, there's not showing anything there. So that's another. So there's 2 different ways of dealing with this overprinting or the mark stacking that happens in version 8. The nice bit about the mark stacking is if we go back to this situation right here, where I have category copy here, and it's going to show me analysis totals, show column grand totals, put category back on rows. It is showing me all those places where there could be something drawn, which can make a lot of diagnosing what's going on in our workbooks easier. So with this, there are so I've done max. So the increasing level of detail in the total computations supports our aggregates of aggregates. Some disadvantages to this, because we've increased the level of detail in the view, every measure is going to need to be altered. So in this case, if I'm wanting to do a sum of sales, oops, put that in the label shelf, it's going to be doing this thing. So I'm going to need to have a table calculation version of this calculation that is going to get me the desired results. Same thing for every other calculation in the view. If you're building some sort of a text table. So it can be a little painful. It has the same problems with expanding and collapsing hierarchies. And if you want, since we're not testing for the grand total row, you can't do a custom sub-aggregation like the min-max technique. So now we're going to move on to the next version, which is using custom SQL. So for this, what we're doing is duplicating our data source. So here, I'm just going to edit connection. So what I've done here is taken my original data, I've added a row to my data field that I'm calling data as the source, and then I'm unioning that to a whole additional copy of my data that I'm calling total. So now I have 2 distinct copies of my data that I can manipulate as I want. So here's my source, and let me do a new worksheet on here because that's a little formatted. So here's my source of my data. If I sum sales, we can see I've got sum of sales of both, and this is highlighting one of the things when you're doing this with custom SQL is to be really careful about your measures, because you're going to need to change all of your measures to deal with that, because it's returning twice as many rows now. So here's my source. I have a data and total source. Now, if I just drag category out here, I've got both of these, and let's say I want a separate total row for this. I need to create a custom field to do this. So here I've created this category header field. So if the source is data, then we're going to return the category, or else we're going to return grand total. So this is what the category header field looks like. It's returning the value of the category within data and grand total for everything else. And then at this point, I can drag and have my measure like sum of sales. I can take category off of it, and Tableau is going to sum it up. Like this, I don't even need source on here. I can take that off, take my grand total row there, and I'm showing something. And if I want to do something like average of sales, it's now computing the average of sales across the second data set. So if I drag my data source out, that can be more visible right here. So within here, there's only the level of detail of this grand total, our average sales. Here we have it split out within each category and doing that. Now with this, just like this, formatting's not that great on it. We're missing all that nice fancy formatting we get when we get this kind of thing. So some ways we can get that back. We can bring our source field into here, and that can get us our lines, and then we can turn off show header on this. We can also format shading. I can do my row banding at this level. Let's set the pane header to be a little darker so they'll show up. So we can get something that's calls out what our grand total row is, and as soon as we've done this, we can also get one of the more popular items on the ideas list, which is to rearrange where we put our grand total, because we've made it its own dimension in a way. So if I want my grand totals on top, I can just sort my source, grand totals on top. If I want to, I can put my grand totals on the left instead of the right. All through using custom SQL. And then because this is a totally separate data source with its own, in a way, because we have this dimension distinguishing it, we can use whatever computation path we want to generate our grand totals. So it's pretty handy for that. So with custom SQL, it is our most flexible one. One thing is you're potentially doubling the data. So one thing you might do in that custom SQL for it as a workaround is, instead of having the duplicate data be a row level select, maybe you already pre-aggregate it so it's a smaller data set. So you don't have so many rows in there. You don't have the same formatting options for it in terms of like making your grand total. You can do header stuff with it, but you can't say I want this column to be bold while everything else isn't. You can change the shading, but not that. And then there's the fact that you're going to have to evaluate all your measures and dimensions and how they work within this double data set. So those are the basic building blocks of how to work with this. Once you have this, all the other funky stuff we can do is based on these particular techniques. So any questions at this point? What if we want multiple total rows, Joe says. Okay, that's in here. So now we'll go on to some more advanced stuff. We can just, let's just go to that one since Joe had asked that right now. Open. So here we're using the Superstore sales data. So here we have a case where we have multiple, our product type, our product, sum of sales, and then a percent of total sales on this. And where this particular thing started was a user had a question where they wanted to not show the percent of total column, show these results, but just show a total row. So in that case, you can just use a custom query. Here, so this is doing if sum sales over total sum sales equals 1, then null. So this is a test of whether we're in this row right here. We could have also done if the count distinct of product is 1 is null, that would work, or we could have done the min-max test as well. There's a whole variety of tests we can use to identify this subtotal row. So then it's returning null for these rows, or else return the sum of sales over total sum of sales. So it's gotten rid of that and just showing an annotation there. Then there's another trick here where if we add a copy of our product type here, we can generate an additional total row using this. And the neat thing here is if we turn off the show header, it still leaves the subtotal for that. So if I turn subtotals off, it's gone. That extra subtotals off is gone, but here it is. So in this case, we turn off show header, and then Tableau stacks these two subtotals together so we can see them together in one place. And for this, because we're showing it's a single column here, and we want to show different number formats. So we have a dollar number format and a percentage number format. It requires this extra bit of work. So instead of returning number values, these are all strings. So within the regular rows, we're returning $ plus string round lookup sum of sales. And here we're doing for the percentage of total, we're doing another string computation. So that way we get the different formats. Now once we've done this kind of thing and have this sort of idea in place, then we can start doing other things, like if it's a string, who cares if it's a number or not? So for example, here's something I came up with, which instead of just doing our regular sum of sales, then once we get into that percent, what was the percentage area, I'm just doing a case on our product type and then returning different values for that. So you could have one option here, for example, in a view, you could use a parameter-based view, and people could put in a parameter here and do their own annotation for it. And here I have it set up in I added a dummy column for a sales heading here. This is within the union query. There's actually a couple of headings here. And we can show it side by side. So we could change this to be a parameter-based thing. Somebody could enter stuff in on the fly, annotate it, print it out, email it to somebody, and do it that way. And Mark just posted something, another good case for this idea, which I will pull open. Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely a little plug here so that formatting text strings is easier. So if you're not voting for ideas, I can tell you that people at Tableau really do look at these, and they're all looking at how many votes these things get to figure out what new features to put in new versions of Tableau. So please vote them up, and I'll have another plug for one later. So that's annotating subtotals. Another thing we can do with totals is something like this, and I'm just going to, stop doing that. A view like this, which is not built with any data reshaping. It's just with grand totals and subtotals, or just grand totals in this case. And this comes from another forum post where somebody wanted to have the current week's total. This is account distinctive orders. And then they wanted for the end of week to have the grand total, and then have for this week, and then show the previous week's total without showing the previous week. So in building this, so here's a week header. So here's our weekday of order date field. So we're generating this. We have a, we're using this table calculation version where our count of them is a window sum of, let's see this, count of orders. Is a window sum of the count distinctive order ID with the if first equals 0 and this other optimization for Tableau 7 to just total those up. So that's what we already covered here. The trick here is that we want to have the prior week header and current week, so we generate separate subtotals. So we have subtotals on our week header, and then to get this to work, I had to generate this calculated field, which is the weekday for hide. So the week header here is just looking at current week and prior week in the data. And then the week, and I base this on a parameter right now. You could base it on today or whatever you wanted for your data. And then the weekday for hide is taking the weekday of the order day and the weekday of header to create a custom field. Because if I try to filter these out using, if I exclude them, that's going to exclude them from all the data in the calculations and make them wrong. If I use a table calculation filter here on our weekday, that will wipe it all out and remove our grand total. But it turns out in Tableau, if I just hide all of these, you can hide a bunch of rows and it will still keep your subtotals in place. So from this, once we get this hidden work from the previous data, we go through a few more steps to turn it into a bar chart. And here we go. So if you're needing to show multiple totals at once, but not show all of some of the data, you can use hide to your advantage. The trick here is creating a field that will let you hide the appropriate data, because if I just hide Friday from example, it's going to hide Friday from both and change my results. And this also gets into order of operations. Hide happens after the table calculation filters are applied. So when I hide data, it hasn't changed this 26 result. So that's hiding it. Can you make that hiding dynamic as the year goes on? Asked Michael. With this particular view, because I set this up so that way this prior week, this is the same no matter what week we're looking at in the data set. So if I change the week to 52, I've changed my results here, but this weekday for hide is still using the same values. So that's how it deals with the data being dynamic, is that it's returning a static. The thing that I'm hiding is static. Does that make sense, Michael? And just waiting for a response here. I'm going to guess he's okay with it then. So that's where it's using this field. So it's this field that takes this day name, weekday of order date, and week header. It's going to be the same. You could use the today function with date trunk to create your week headers. Yep. Yeah, this was a case for this particular situation. So Mark was saying without using a parameter, you could use the today function with date trunk to create your week headers. Yeah. So for the thing that I was running into with this one and using a parameter was that this was getting posted to the forums, and the data, since the data in Superstore sales can change and is not necessarily up to date, like this is version 7 Superstore sales, so it's only through 2012. I wanted to use an anchor. But in practice, that's what I'd be using. So that's, and I actually, you said using date trunk. I'd probably use, date trunk for week headers, yeah. So for this particular week header, we could have it show some specific date to show that. Now there's one other thing when we get into grand totals here, is maybe you don't want to put your totals on, not necessarily, we've been focusing a lot on text tables, and maybe you want to show them in other places. Let's make this one with a view. And we'll go back to the beginning. So if we have something like a bar chart and we throw a reference line on it, Tableau is going to extend the axis to fill out the reference line, and so it makes all the bars small. So some different, and even if we do a grand total here on a bar chart, so same thing, analysis, totals, show column grand totals, it's going to put it in here. It just makes a bigger bar. So there's some different options we have here. We can do things like make a table calculation and then just set that up to be a label that only works on the maximum mark, only shows up for the max mark in there. Because Tableau will resize the axis to fit mark labels in the view, so it's going to be it there. We can also use mark annotations to put it in place, but here it's tied to this particular mark, same kind of thing. We can even throw a second, here I have a secondary axis, which is 1.1 times the maximum sales in the view, and then it just plugs that in there on a label. Or we could do that secondary axis as a reference line. So there's an invisible mark here in this view, and then a reference line tag to it, tag to a value to show in there. You can also start with Tableau version 8. You can take your totals and do them as a dashboard with 2 different worksheets. So here's a worksheet with my total. And then there's doing things like throwing your totals in the title, inside a caption. Something else I've also done in some cases, I didn't do string formatting on this, but you can have a discrete header, which is returning your total sales. You can also, at least in Tableau Desktop, you can just turn on your summary card for a sum sales, and it'll show that in there. And in the case of some, we have the status bar here, which is also showing stuff down at the bottom. So lots of different ways of doing that. And then for taking grand totals from here, the area that I'm still exploring and working on myself, so we covered hiding annotations, is doing when you have in your, the value that you have in your view is some sort of table calculation, and then you're wanting to do a different aggregation of your table calculation in there, and it requires increasing the level of detail in the view to pull it off, which means changing all of your original table calculations to handle the increased level of detail. And it's kind of like using those biohazard chambers where you'll reach in with rubber gloves to diddle something, to work around with something through rubber gloves, and it's kind of like working through something with rubber gloves in the dark to figure that out. So I'm still figuring out kind of how to document and make that work on its own in some way that it works. And the basic process there is we're combining the tests for whether we're in a detail row or a grand total row, with working with the increased level of detail for the table calculations to work within the grand total row. And that's everything I prepared. Any questions?
That was awesome, Jonathan. Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any other questions come through.
Okay. So one thing to make all this life easier, if this is my ask of you guys following this call or even right now, is go to this particular idea on the Tableau forum, which is to have our totals and subtotals be working over the marks that are displayed. So this would let us control those aggregations and not have to do all this crazy table calculation stuff to figure things out. So if you can please vote that up, that would be great for you and for everybody else who has to deal with this and try to figure it out.
Great. I'll be sure to do that right after we get off this call as well. Actually, Jonathan, do you want to, if you throw the link into the chat window, then everyone can just click on it.
Okay. Great. All right. And there it is.
Sweet.
And what's Dustin's refresh the idea page? Means there.
Dustin, what do you mean by that?
Oh, great.
Oh.
Yeah. 40% increase in just a couple minutes. That's awesome. Sweet.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jonathan, for putting this all together. And I'll post the video either later today or tomorrow.
Awesome. And I will, should I just post the workbook and stuff to the forum, or do you want to do that?
You can either send it to me or you just post it after I post it. It's up to you.
Okay, great.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you again, Jonathan, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Okay, thank you all.
All righty. Bye-bye.